Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the man who quietly controlled power from behind the scenes in New York City. Known for his calm presence and sharp mind, Salerno built his influence through respect, patience, and quiet authority. To some, he was a businessman who understood people and politics. To others, he was a symbol of old-school loyalty and strength within the underworld. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. Now, close your eyes and imagine the streets of Harlem, the quiet corners where deals were made, and the steady rise of a man whose power came not from fear but from respect. Settle in, and let the story of Anthony Salerno guide you into the night. Anthony Salerno was born on the 15th of August 1911 in Italian Harlem, a pocket of Manhattan where stoops, storefronts, and church steps formed a village. His parents were immigrants who carried old country habits into a new country hustle. Money was scarce, and kids learned fast. Anthony grew up with the neighborhood's code. Stay loyal, keep family first, avoid loose lips. School didn't hold him, the streets did. By his teens, he was doing errands for older men who hung around the corner clubs, a world where delivery boys learned the rhythms of numbers betting, card games, and loans made in cash and repaid on time because people understood the consequences of falling behind. He had an easy laugh and a big frame, the kind of presence that made people remember him. But what moved him forward wasn't volume or muscle, it was reliability. If he said he'd handle something, it got handled. In East Harlem, the numbers racket wasn't just a pastime. It was an intake valve for cash that flowed through the entire neighborhood. Factory hands, doormen, cooks, seamstresses, bartenders. Everybody tossed a few coins at a daily number. If you hit, you kept food on the table through a tough week. If you missed, you tried again tomorrow. It wasn't legal, but it was organized. And young Salerno learned that organization is power. He became a runner, then a collector, then a man who settled disputes without ever appearing impatient. He learned to manage bets, to keep books tidy, to memorize faces and routes. He absorbed the street's unwritten ledger, who owed, who paid, who needed a break because a kid was sick, who needed a warning because bad habits threatened the business. He had a boss in those days, then another, because crews and titles shifted as bigger figures fought for control over Manhattan's gambling territory, especially after national headlines and old-time gunmen changed the map of Harlem's policy games. As the years moved, Anthony found himself trusted by older captains, tied to the network later known as the Genovese family. They didn't call it that then, but the same currents ran through the city. He operated through the 116th Street Crew, a unit based in Italian Harlem that specialized in numbers, bookmaking, and loan sharking. By the 1940 seconds and into the 1950 seconds, he wasn't a kid anymore. He had runners, he had collectors, he had a circle of quiet allies. He had a base where he could sit every day and direct business. That base would become famous decades later. The Palma Boys Social Club. It looked like a friendly room with a coffee pot and a back table. But if you wanted to understand the economy of East Harlem, you had to understand that the most important offices never had signs. Through that door, deals were made that touched construction sites, trucking lanes, and after-hours gambling rooms, with money trickling into envelopes that fed a wide web of men. His racket spanned the basics of the street trade. Bookmakers took sports action ball games and horse races, then kicked a share up. Numbers writers sold three-digit dreams to thousands every day. Loan sharking brought cash to folks who couldn't get bank loans, with steep percentages that kept the borrower under pressure. Salerno oversaw these operations for his crew, ensuring regular collections, fair discipline by underworld standards, and a balance that kept the machine running. Violence didn't vanish from that world, but he often preferred a talk or a nudge over fireworks. It wasn't sentimentality, it was business sense. Scares draw headlines. Headlines invite heat. The best kind of racket, in his view, was the kind a neighborhood accepted as inevitable. By the 1950 seconds, the city's underworld leadership grew more formal. The commission that managed the families existed to prevent the kind of open warfare that brought federal agents and grand juries. Anthony grew in that climate. He wasn't a boss then. He was a crew leader whose reputation rested on dependability and money. He kept the numbers racket paying. He also diversified. The coin-operated machine trade jukeboxes, pinball, cigarette machines toned the balance sheets of those who controlled routes and placements. Trucking companies and warehouses fed another revenue stream. More quietly, he developed a taste for real estate, picking up parcels in the Bronx and beyond. Those properties provided legitimizing cover and steady rent, while he continued to oversee gambling and loans in East Harlem and the Bronx. In this period, he built influence by connecting street earnings to larger ventures. Unions mattered because they controlled who poured concrete, who drove trucks, who got hired first, and who sat home. Salerno's crew worked with union officers who played ball, ensuring contracts rolled to friendly contractors. Nobody wrote those terms down in public, but people understood. If you were a builder who wanted a large project to run smoothly, cement delivered on time, no job site issues, you paid a tax. That levy, often skimmed off huge Manhattan projects, became known in courtrooms years later as a fee collected by a small club of approved concrete firms. The people who made that list didn't come from business school. They came from the same rooms where numbers were counted at midnight, and Salerno was one of the men who kept that list short and profitable. In the 1,960 seconds, he was already a figure known to law enforcement. Arrests and indictments for gambling and related racketeering surfaced from time to time. Often these cases ended with fines or short stints. Federal agents mapped his network, recorded license plates outside the club, and compiled charts linking names to businesses. But the flow of cash continued. He'd beaten cases before, and would beat more. He was careful. He used intermediaries. He learned never to say more than necessary. Even when he faced charges, he projected calm in court, the picture of a neighborhood businessman with a bad press agent. By the 1,970 seconds, Salerno's shape in the world had shifted from street captain to power broker. The East Harlem scene had changed as families moved to the suburbs, and the neighborhood evolved. But the crew's earnings stayed dependable. Sports betting grew. Numbers stayed popular. Loan accounts grew with inflation. His Bronx base became more prominent, while he still kept the Harlem clubhouse as a daily touchstone. Health troubles began creeping in. He was heavy, he smoked cigars endlessly, and reports mentioned strokes later on, but he kept showing up. People kissed him hello on the cheek. Drivers ferried him between properties and clubs. He was guarded but not flashy. He liked to sit, to preside, to hear problems and render decisions. He trusted a handful of lieutenants who funneled receipts, settled turf disputes, and smoothed hiccups with union contacts in concrete, trucking, and carpentry. Investigators would later argue that by the end of the 1,970 seconds, he served as a public face of power for the Genovese family. Leadership in that organization operated like a shell game. The man who looked in charge might be a decoy, while the real boss faded into the background. After the death of a prior front leader, Frank Thierry, in 1981, Salerno was widely seen by agents and reporters as the new top man. Whether he truly held ultimate authority or acted as a screen for another figure would be argued for years. But what mattered to the outside world was that important underworld business was discussed in his presence. He was observed holding court at the Harlem Club, in the Bronx, and at restaurants where captains met. The message to anyone who needed an answer on gambling, loans, construction, or union muscle was simple. Talk to Tony. With that status came bigger responsibilities and risks. He was credited by prosecutors with a role in a citywide arrangement that affected multi-million-dollar construction projects. Approved contractors got work on big towers and civic buildings. Anyone outside the circle waited forever or paid dearly. A fee came off the top of concrete pours, and union stewards ensured work stayed untroubled. This was the kind of long-term, low-drama control that Salerno preferred. While others chased headlines or feuded in the open, he stuck to the formulas that had fed East Harlem's private economy for decades. Keep the money moving, keep peace among earners, and keep the action quiet enough to avoid a public storm. Of course the storm came. Federal agents had refined surveillance by then. They put ears in clubhouses and restaurants parked across from the Palma Boys social club, logged cars and visitors, and filed court papers that tracked who met whom. They had informants. They had tapes. As the 980 seconds opened. Prosecutors looked to tie together gambling, loan sharking, extortion of contractors, and influence over unions into sweeping cases. Salerno's name appeared often. He had arrests behind him for illegal gambling and related tax issues. He had dodged serious time before. But the next round would be different. A broad prosecution model would try to show not only that he ran gambling and loans, but that he helped steer a network that taxed major industries and used union authority as leverage. In the evening, at the Palma Boys social club, he still held to his routine. He'd sit at the back, a thick cigar drawing that small orange circle against the dim wall, call for coffee, play cards or watch others play, listen as men leaned in. Nothing about it seemed loud or urgent. But neighborhoods knew whose nods mattered. Gamblers and bookies knew where collections went. Contractors knew which phone call to return promptly. Drivers knew which sedan should be waiting at a curb. Detectives knew which windows to watch when the blinds tilted at dusk. The man at the center had walked East Harlem's blocky grid his entire life, and even as the city reshaped itself, his schedule remained stubbornly familiar. To understand his power, you have to picture that routine, because it explains how crime blends into a city's daily business without fanfare. Every dollar of numbers betting became a stream that fed runners, then collectors, then a cut for higher crews. Every loan carried interest that cascaded upward. Every set aside for a concrete pour moved through a chain of union contacts and middlemen. None of that happened with public announcements. It happened through nods, closed doors, and habits formed over years. Salerno had a talent for holding those habits steady. He didn't invent them. He inherited and refined them, building a reputation that made other men defer to his timing and judgment. By the time national newspapers were putting his picture on front pages, he had already lived decades as the neighborhood's quiet manager. Those headlines would harden into indictments. The story would move from Harlem to federal courtrooms, from smoke-filled corners to microphones and transcripts. But before that wave hit, in the stretch of years when he sat beneath framed photos and fading paint at the club, he was exactly what the city saw if it knew where to look. A man who ran gambling, loans, and labor influence with a steady hand. A man who collected percentages off concrete and trucking. A man who placed himself as the clearinghouse for underworld business and called it, with a straight face, looking after the neighborhood. All the while, he kept investing in properties that paid rent without attention, leaving his name on deeds and behind the scenes in partnerships. He had associates in the Bronx, Westchester, and upstate towns who managed rentals, garages, and strip mall storefronts. Those assets gave him income that could be described without embarrassment, while the illegal money kept the crew flush. It was a strategy that enriched him and insulated the operation. Even when authorities took aim at the gambling, the property stream stayed alive, buffering the shocks and legal fees that came with investigations. The portrait that emerges from these years is not of a man chasing thrills. It's a planner who built a quiet empire from small bets and steady pressure, then widened that empire by connecting the corner trade to the city's biggest business, building its skyline, gambling, loan sharking, extortion through union leverage, skimming from construction, controlling which companies got what work. These were the core rackets under his watch. He avoided flamboyant crime scenes and headline-grabbing violence. He supported a structure that kept a lid on trouble and collected earnings day after day, year after year. The calm could not last forever. Agents had every reason to aim higher than small gambling cases. They wanted leaders, not runners. They wanted to prove that men like Anthony Salerno didn't only run betting parlors. They shaped the markets for concrete, windows, and freight. They wanted to show juries how a greeting in a social club led to $1 million job. As the 1,980 seconds took shape, that was the challenge he faced. He'd built his life on keeping attention low. Suddenly, attention was the whole game, and the city he'd helped manage from behind a tinted doorway was about to carry his name into a courtroom where routine could no longer protect him. Dawn in the Bronx comes with a pale light and the smell of bakery air drifting over a block where the blinds on a corner storefront are still half drawn. A sedan idles. A man with a newspaper pretends to read while watching the door. Inside, the room is quiet but alert. Coats on chairbacks, cards in a rubber-banded pack, a battered coffee pot warming on a two-burner stove. A heavy-set figure arrives, slow but steady, a cigar already lit, face unreadable. He nods to the room, drops into his usual chair, and starts asking small questions whose answers mean everything: who paid, who stalled, which job site got its deliveries, which foreman became a problem. This is how a city's shadow economy wakes up. No shouting, no rush. Just the daily review. The figure at the center has carried this ritual from East Harlem to these Bronx blocks for decades. He didn't brand it. He sustained it. The name the papers gave him, Fat Tony, never changed how he saw himself. A neighborhood manager whose ledger ran on cash, memory, and quiet leverage. Years earlier, the first hard glare came with the Senate's traveling circus, the Kefauver hearings. Television cameras turned mob talk into front-page spectacle, and East Harlem's numbers bosses felt the heat. Detectives and reporters learned to say policy and bank in the same breath, then aimed those words at the 116th Street corridor. When subpoenas followed, Anthony kept to the pattern that would mark his entire life. He said little, invoked rights when needed, and walked back to the club without a dramatic scene. Names swirled: old guard bosses, bagmen, betters. But the day after each headline, people still played the numbers, still made payments, still came looking for a quiet loan after a medical bill or a broken axle. The economy under him ran on habit even when cameras swung toward it. During those post-war years, as older captains were jailed, died, or disappeared, Anthony stepped up inside the 116th Street crew. The neighborhood's long-standing numbers empire needed a new steady hand. He offered one. He set routes for riders and runners, put collectors on regular schedules, and made sure cash moved upward without frayed edges. He also understood that enforcement didn't have to be loud. A word at a doorway, a seat taken beside someone at a bakery table, a reminder delivered by a trusted collector, that was his style. People who lived by the daily three-digit dream saw it as a community ritual. He kept it that way. He didn't try to be a movie villain. He tried to be a working boss whose system never stopped. His operations had layers. There were the policy banks that balanced bets so payouts wouldn't crash the house if a popular number hit. There were bookmaking sheets that tracked sports action with code names and city nicknames, each better cataloged by a runner who knew if payday fell Thursday or Friday. There were companies that were really a phone number and a man with a notebook, positioned so customers could call in picks. There were loan ledgers with interest built in week by week, rates steep enough that borrowers rarely broke free but not so punishing that cash flow died. And there were envelopes that went to police or inspectors with a wink that kept certain doors from opening at awkward moments. Prosecutors would say, years later, that protection money circulated through these blocks as faithfully as the mail. He made time for legal investments. He bought property walk-ups in the Bronx, storefronts near busy corners, small warehouses along corridors where trucks moved steadily. Deeds bore his name openly or tucked behind partners. Tenants paid rent, repairs got made, leases rolled over quietly. Real estate produced clean returns and cover. It let him sit in the club and say he had a day job. It also created bargaining chips, a space to rent to a friendly contractor, a garage to offer a trucking company that needed overnight parking, a small warehouse that could be sublet to a vending route operator who preferred not to disclose all inventory. When you've built your life around informal networks, a legitimate building can be just as useful as a wire room. The structure above him evolved in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. Citywide leadership tried to prevent old-style wars by meeting, dividing turf, and setting rules. The Harlem crew fit into that framework. Anthony answered to bigger figures and paid the customary cut. He made himself valuable by delivering consistent money, keeping conflict low, and expanding into areas that matched his temperament. Vending machines, jukebox routes, cigarette machines, small trucking outfits. These weren't headline grabbers, but they threw off cash. He doubled down on relationships with union men who could make life easy or hard at a loading dock, a construction site, or an arena where chairs and risers had to be set up overnight. You had to know who held which card. He always knew. By the late 1,960 seconds, law enforcement knew his name. Gambling busts came, sometimes with a taxi load of reporters outside a precinct. Arrest records show he caught charges for illegal betting operations and related tax counts. Nothing stuck hard enough to slow him for long. He pleaded, paid, or fought, then took his seat again in the club. He rarely lost his temper in public. Even when the city's tabloids turned his nickname into a punchline, he maintained the routine: cigar, coffee, soft talk, the daily review. That routine was his armor. He'd inherited a job where showing panic was showing weakness. In the 1,970 seconds, an older man now, he cemented his role as the Harlem crew's top earner and arbiter, while spending more time in the Bronx. The Palma Boys Social Club, its blinds tilted just so, its door watched by men who knew every face, became the address everyone could find, but nobody explained. Real power liked the way he did business. He was put forward more often for high-level conversations about divides, fees, and who should handle which territories. He sat with captains from other boroughs, with middlemen who ran unions, with contractors who wanted to keep cranes moving without delays. He didn't need a title to matter. People understood his nod. The city's building boom made concrete into a private mint. Everyone understood that a skyscraper's schedule lives or dies by concrete deliveries, and whether crews show up ready to pour. An arrangement grew around that choke point. Only certain concrete firms got the biggest jobs. Those firms paid a fee. Union officers made sure pickets didn't arrive, and forms didn't sit empty while a company begged for trucks. The man who ran the union action most directly, later named in court papers, was tied to a different family. But the money and decisions flowed through a committee that included leaders from several groups. Investigators would call it the Concrete Club. It became a core revenue stream for bosses across town. Anthony's standing meant he had a voice in which firms got approved and how that fee was distributed. This wasn't smash and grab crime. It was a hidden tax on the skyline, the same pattern repeated in other places where a handful of men could squeeze a market. Garment trucks needed safe passage so shops could meet deadlines. Dock workers needed assignments that didn't leave ships idle. Vending routes wanted exclusive access in cafeterias, bars, and union halls. Each domain had a steward or business agent willing to play ball. Anthony kept those relationships oiled. He didn't need to be at every meeting. His word traveled by courier, by code on a payphone, by a dinner where a final number was whispered and the subject dropped. Those arrangements survived changes in mayors and police commissioners because they lived in the spaces between written rules. Around this time, his health changed. He carried more weight. He'd had what doctors called episodes later understood as strokes that left traces, even as he returned to his chair at the club. Men helped him in and out of cars. He kept moving, kept working. To outside eyes, that image older, slow steps, a lit cigar made him look more like a local patriarch than a corporate villain. If people underestimated him because of it, he didn't complain. He used the cover. He held talks in the same rooms, under the same framed photos, in the same quiet tone. The government adjusted too. Surveillance grew more sophisticated. Agents planted microphones in social clubs, restaurants, and cars. They sat in apartments across the street with binoculars, writing down license plates at all hours. They flipped insiders, sometimes low-level, sometimes close enough to touch top decision-makers. They mapped connections from policy banks to job sites to union locals. And they started to assemble cases that didn't focus on a single bookmaking room, but on the commission that tied 5 families together. If you could prove the existence of a board of directors, you could prosecute an entire system instead of slicing off one piece at a time. In 1984, Congress gave prosecutors a new edge, a bail law that allowed pretrial detention for defendants deemed dangerous to the community, even if danger meant economic harm rather than physical assault. When Anthony was indicted on racketeering charges that pulled together gambling, extortion in the concrete industry, and control over unions, the government used that law. They argued that freeing him would let the same hidden taxes continue. He fought that argument all the way up the appeals ladder. The case reached the highest court, with his name stamped on its cover. The result reshaped American criminal procedure. The justices upheld preventive detention, saying the law as applied passed constitutional muster. The name on that decision? United States vs. Salerno became a citation law students still memorize, a strange twist for a man whose life's work depended on staying off paper. While lawyers argued, marshals moved him between courthouses and detention centers, his schedule replaced by a chain of transport orders and lockup calls. The larger conspiracy case was already rolling. Indictments named leaders from multiple families. Papers said prosecutors sought to break the commission's back by proving leaders fixed bids in the concrete market, dictated union policy, and took slices from major jobs all over Manhattan, including big-name towers. Jurors would hear that a union officer on the city's concrete scene collected fees on behalf of top figures and directed which companies got work. They would listen to tapes taken inside clubs where men spoke in euphemisms about deliveries, lists, and percentages. They would see charts that traced phone calls, restaurant sit-downs, and envelopes moving from site to office to backroom. Anthony's lawyers argued that the government had cast him as a chief when he was only a neighborhood boss, that he'd become a symbol because he stayed visible while others hid in apartments and moved like ghosts. They said age, health, and the limited reach of his crew didn't match the kingpin theory. They cross-examined agents about translations of coded talk. They questioned contractors about whether delays on jobs came from labor pressure or from normal city headaches. They tried to pull the concrete rackets out of the realm of conspiracy and into the realm of ordinary New York friction. Even as the trial moved, his old life flickered in fragments. Runners now reported to other men. The club's blinds still tilted. Coffee still bubbled. Numbers still got written down, collected, and paid. The machine he'd built continued because it never relied on one pair of hands. He had taught that. Replace the top, and the gears keep turning. But the tone on the street changed. A leader under indictment is a leader with open questions around him. People began hedging their bets, making side channels, building contingency plans. No racket survives without accounting for tomorrow. While the jury listened to tapes about concrete, another investigation assembled a different industry story. Window replacement contracts for public housing, worth many millions, had become their own rigging project. Bids were coordinated. A handful of firms rotated wins. Money skimmed off. Contracts flowed to multiple families. Names linked to Anthony surfaced again in those papers. He wasn't on the street anymore. But prosecutors alleged his old habit of quietly allocating markets had contributed to another hidden tax on a city function that should have gone to the lowest honest bidder. That second wave would land after the first trial, deepening his legal trouble even as age and illness closed in. The portrait that formed in those courtrooms rested on decades of habits. Gambling and bookmaking weren't footnotes. They were the foundation. Loan sharking kept cash flowing. And customers bound tight. Extortion of the concrete industry translated block power into skyline influence. Union control, sometimes by direct orders, sometimes by unspoken arrangement, allowed hidden hands to stir job site conditions toward or away from turbulence. Real estate investments gave him a legal footprint and income that didn't require coded language. All of it fit a single temperament. Steady, patient, allergic to spectacle. He wasn't the man who'd pound a table and spray threats. He was the one who'd nod, assign, and expect that the assignment would be carried out. People around him learned to speak in half sentences. A package could mean a cut. A list could mean which firms had the right to bid. Take care of him meant deliver a payment or a reminder, not some cinematic act. Those conversations, when recorded, sounded like ordinary talk, unless you'd lived inside the system long enough to hear the undertones. Jurors were asked to hear those undertones. The defense asked them to hear ordinary noise. The difference would decide whether the city's hidden economy had a set of authors or simply 1,000 small schemes bumping into each other. By the middle of the 1,980 seconds, public perception fixed Anthony as the top figure in his organization. Newspapers wrote it as fact. Agents treated it as settled. People whispered doubts in back rooms because they knew the trick the Genovese family liked to play. Keep a front leader in view while the actual boss moved in the shadows. Inside the case files, a development would soon complicate the public story. A trusted insider, Vincent Cafaro, decided to cooperate. He sat with agents and prosecutors and described a hierarchy that placed a different man quiet, reclusive, rarely caught on tape at the very top. Cafaro said Anthony was the face, not the final word. That revelation would echo through later trials and help explain how the family stayed resilient, even as marquee names went down. But the jurors in the big case were still hearing Anthony's voice on those scratchy recordings and seeing his figure in photographs taken outside the club. To them, he looked like power, because the city had been taught for years to look where Saturday. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't give interviews. When reporters called him Fat Tony, he refused to take the bait. He would tell marshals the same thing he'd told city cops for decades. Nothing helpful. In quiet moments, he'd read the paper and shake his head at a city that suddenly pretended to be shocked by gambling and rigging when it had lived with both since the days of speakeasies. He knew what he had done. He knew where the money came from. He knew which jobs had been steered and which checks cut. He also knew that the old agreements, the ones that kept construction moving and labor calm, were turning into evidence exhibits. The practical speak of his life, keep things smooth, keep money moving, keep disputes small, had been rebranded in court as racketeering. In the end, what made Anthony Salerno matter wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the layer cake of crime he participated in and directed over half a century. Numbers betting up and down East Harlem and the Bronx. Bookmaking that treated sports seasons like harvests. Loans at rates that trapped debtors for years. Quiet pressure on vendors and trucking companies. Hidden taxes on concrete pours for sites that changed the skyline. And a talent for reaching into unions without standing at a microphone. He didn't invent those rackets. He inherited a few, seized others, then kept them earning. When the cases finally pressed him into a corner, it was because the city he'd helped manage from folding chairs and back tables had learned to wire its own rooms and turn that management into a conspiracy on a chart. The old calm at the club would soon give way to the measured formality of a courtroom. The men who once stood at the doorway during late-night card games would now stand beside him in suits, fingers folded, watching a jury decide where decades of steady, quiet hustle had brought them. The courthouse had a certain chill even in summer, a polished echo that turned footsteps into a kind of drumbeat as long lines moved through metal detectors. He arrived without the props that had framed him for decades. No club chair, no cigar, no sidewalk greeting. He wore a suit, sat still, and watched the room the way he'd scanned doorways for half a lifetime. On one side, prosecutors stacked tapes, charts, ledgers, and lists of names. On the other, his lawyers arranged files that claimed those same objects told a smaller story. Behind it all, the city leaned forward. For years, rumor and surveillance had circled a handful of leaders. Now the government said it could prove not just that bookmaking and loan sharking persisted, but that a board of directors existed, a committee that fixed prices in concrete and steered union power like a rudder. They put Anthony Salerno at the table. He had already lost a fight before the trial truly began. Under a new law, the government argued that releasing him would harm the community by letting illegal markets keep running. Judges kept him inside. Appeals stretched to the highest court. Lawyers cited constitutional principles, balked at preventive detention, warned of abuses. The ruling came down with cool formality. The law stood. United States v. Salerno would become a citation in casebooks, a strange legacy for a man who avoided paper trails. He heard the news in custody, surrounded by cinder block and fluorescent light, adjusting to a schedule announced by intercom rather than by the first coffee poured at the club. In the trial that followed, the story prosecutors told reached back years. They played tapes made inside the Palma Boys social club, in restaurants, and in cars. Those recordings captured a vocabulary that sounded harmless to anyone outside the circle. Packages, lists, friends, jobs, ordinary words that, in context, prosecutors said referred to percentages, approved bidders, loyal intermediaries, and construction projects worth millions. Charts showed an arrangement for concrete contracts across Manhattan. Only certain companies were allowed to pour on the largest jobs. A fee came off the top. Union officers guaranteed calm, and envelopes moved on schedule. The mechanism had a nickname in investigative files, a private name passed among agents and informants. It was presented to jurors as a hidden tax on the skyline that enriched bosses across several families, with Salerno credited as a central voice. Gambling formed the base of the narrative. Agents traced numbers running that stretched from East Harlem stoops to Bronx storefronts, wrapped in phone calls, code names, and notebooks kept by runners who never imagined their careful handwriting would be projected on a wall for strangers to study. Bookmaking records tracked sports seasons week by week, with bets placed on football in autumn, basketball in winter, baseball in spring and summer. Money flowed up from writers to collectors to higher ranks, with a cut always earmarked for leadership. Loans were part of the picture too. Cash offered on short notice at steep rates, the kind of help that felt like rescue the first week and like a trap after that. Prosecutors presented every layer as one network guided by men who met in back rooms and social clubs while keeping their names off the paperwork. The labor piece made jurors sit straighter. Witnesses described meetings where contractors were told which companies would bid and which price to file to keep the rotation intact. A union official testified about collecting a set fee per cubic yard of concrete poured on major sites, delivered on behalf of bosses, and divided according to long-standing rules. Some of these witnesses had once shaken hands with Salerno in doorways where coffee steamed and card games paused. Now they pointed across a courtroom and said he had influence that traveled far beyond Harlem blocks. Defense attorneys tried to shrink that story, arguing that the city has always had tangled labor relations, that delays on big projects come from ordinary chaos, and that placing their client at the top of a citywide conspiracy stretched the tapes and testimony beyond what they really showed. He sat there as an older man with an old face. The strokes had left their marks. He didn't look like a director of large enterprises. He looked like a retired neighborhood figure who still believed in long afternoons over espresso. That image had helped him for years. It didn't save him now. When the verdict came, it struck hard across the defense table. The jurors accepted the government's broad map. A commission existed. Racketeering linked gambling, extortion, and labor corruption. And Salerno had a seat high at that table. Sentencing arrived with numbers that stunned even veteran observers, terms measured in a century. Fines, forfeiture orders that targeted the assets he'd gathered in the Bronx and beyond. He was in his 70s when he heard the time pronounced, the sort of sentence that doesn't leave a door. Behind bars, the world shrank. Instead of a club door opening to the same block each morning, there were counts, controlled movements, lights that never truly dimmed. He read the papers, followed appeals, and watched as debates he had once conducted in whispers played out in headlines. There's an irony in a quiet man becoming a symbol. To prosecutors, he had become a summary of a problem. Entrenched crime families, taxing industries, deciding who worked, who waited, and who paid. To defenders of the old neighborhood code, he was a fixture at the club. In prison, symbols don't mean much. Meals come on trays. Healthcare, even in a specialized unit, has limits. He aged as the appeals wound through slow channels. The appeals framed another twist. A trusted insider, Vincent Cafaro, came forward to cooperate. He told agents and grand jurors that the Genovese family had long used a decoy method. Put one man in the window and keep the true boss out of sight. In his account, Salerno served as that window. The man behind the curtain, he said, was Vincent Gigante, a figure known for avoiding cameras and for cultivating an eccentric public act that made trial schedules complicated for years. If that account was accurate, then Salerno had carried the heat while someone else carried the final veto power. The government would later adjust its statements and cases to reflect that model. To the public, the correction felt like a revelation. To men who had sat in the club for years, it sounded like confirmation of a rumor they had never repeated where a recorder might hear. His legal trouble didn't stop with the big commission case. Investigators turned to public housing contracts, focusing on window replacement deals that ran into the tens of the Lake, millions. The pattern looked familiar. Bids that rotated among a small circle, prices kept artificially high. Union influence applied to keep outside firms frustrated. Indictments named leaders from more than one family, even from prison. Salerno found his name attached to the scheme, accused of having played a role in shaping the market and taking a cut while he was still on the street. That case ended with more convictions and further time, tacked onto a sentence that already measured far beyond any life expectancy. The list of charges across his case is racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to restrain trade, illegal gambling, tax violations, wire and mail fraud counts that accompanied the larger picture, became a ledger of the city's tolerated arrangements coming under concentrated attack. While courtrooms kept generating transcripts, the operations he'd tended for years transformed without him. The state lottery continued to claw away at daily numbers play, turning what had been an underground neighborhood ritual into a government product promoted on billboards. Sports betting remained lively, but technology shifted the balance. What had once been a bookie's phone line turned into more complex networks, some of them beyond the city. Loans still made their rounds because hard weeks never vanish, but banks changed. and so did credit. Union power remained critical, yet federal oversight expanded. Trusteeships replaced some leaders, and reformers pushed into roles that had once been handed out by quiet nods. The machine continued to earn for others, but the city was not the same one he had walked for decades. In the blocks where he'd made his life, the absence felt strange. The Palma Boys Social Club still sat under its sign, a familiar door on a familiar street. Younger faces took old seats. The blinds tilted the same way at dusk, but the conversations changed. Headlines about indictments had a chilling effect. People lowered their voices even further, avoided certain subjects, and switched to safer topics in public. Property managers visited to talk about leases and repairs rather than envelopes and collections. A generation that had grown up under the old rules watched as those rules were forced to bend. Some of them adjusted quickly. Others struggled to imagine the neighborhood without the rhythm Anthony had enforced: money moving predictably, disputes settled in private, jobs that relied on being in someone's good book rather than on an open bid. He marked time by appeals, by occasional transfers for medical care, and by the ritual of reading about a city he once guided from the edges. Prison doesn't allow denial to last. He knew why he was there. He knew what he'd done. He had taken a willing role in gambling, loans, and extortion rackets that drew income from thousands of ordinary lives. He had helped impose fees on construction that raised costs on projects the public watched rise from rebar to glass. He had used union access to shape markets. He might have preferred quiet to spectacle, but quiet doesn't soften the impact for people who paid the price. Even so, he kept his old discipline about confession. He didn't grant interviews, didn't write letters that might become exhibits in future hearings, didn't feed the legend, or try to recast himself as a misunderstood businessman. Some nights, the news cycle turned back toward him because of the bail case that bore his name. Law professors debated it, prosecutors cited it, defense attorneys tried to push around its edges. The ruling had said the government could hold certain defendants before trial to protect the community from nonviolent harm. The decision had been born out of his case, yet it would touch people he had never met, a legal ripple spreading far beyond the concrete roots and card games that had defined his life. That irony worked its way into profiles that appeared every few years. A man known for whisper meetings in a Harlem club ended up attached to a doctrine about public safety that shaped bail hearings across the country. The government's long campaign against the old commission model continued. More cooperators surfaced. More tapes made their way into court. The picture of the Genovese family sharpened, with prosecutors placing Vincent Gigante above the level where they had once placed Salerno. If he read those accounts, he read them without visible reaction. Whether he had agreed to play the public role as a favor, as strategy, or as the inevitable result of his visibility at the club remained a subject for speculation. The truth of that arrangement, like so much else in that world, lived behind closed doors. What lived in public were the records, indictments, pleas, verdicts, and sentences. He had never been the only man running cash routes or leaning on job sites. Others continued. Some got swept up. Some slid past the nets. The best operators always sought distance between themselves and the hand that signed a contract, the truck that delivered materials, the union steward who decided where a crew would stand in the morning. That distance had blurred for Anthony because of the way he chose to live present, greeting people on the same corners, keeping the same hours. It made the neighborhood see him as the owner of its routines. It also made agents' jobs easier. If you wanted to map the city's hidden economies, you started with the door everyone knew. Any fair accounting of his crimes has to include the way he turned community trust into leverage. The numbers trade sounds small in a single bet, but it adds up over a year, over a block, over a decade. Loans with old-world terms adrift in a modern city keep people paying and paying. Protection deals look like business until someone tries to walk away. The concrete arrangement was not victimless just because towers rose on time. When a circle sets prices in secret, the public pays in larger budgets, and rival companies are cut out before they can compete. Anthony's skill was to make these systems feel, to his neighbors, like services rather than burdens. He kept the streets quiet. He kept disputes small. He kept cash moving. That skill protected him for years. It also helped feed the reach that brought him down. In late-night quiet inside the facility where he now lived, he sometimes sat across from another old-timer from a different crew. They'd trade neutral stories, Weather, food, headlines, the ball club. Neither man asked for pity. They had chosen their paths. The city beyond those fences had changed so much that the clubs of their youth felt like memories from a black and white film. Still, certain constants remained. Some job sites still turned on relationships. Some unions still struggled with people who wanted to use them as private checkbooks. Some gamblers still chased the daily number just for the jolt of possibility. The machine never stops entirely. It only changes shape. He had lived long enough to see the Genovese family adapt again. However much he had controlled in Harlem and the Bronx, however much he had influenced concrete and windows, others now ran the day-to-day. They used new methods, new intermediaries, and fresh faces who didn't carry the old nicknames. The Genovese habit of hiding true leadership behind a public figure persisted for years because it worked. He had been that figure at a critical moment. He bore the cost. The club door on 116th Street remained part of the neighborhood's landscape, a relic of a time when much of East Harlem's economy flowed through a single room. To understand what Anthony Salerno represented, you have to walk past that door in your mind and picture the layers beyond it: a runner with a notebook, a collector with a schedule, a union man with a list of who works tomorrow, a contractor looking for certainty, a boss in a felt hat willing to make a call. Then picture that same network translated into exhibits and jury instructions. That is how a quiet routine known as business got reframed as racketeering in the eyes of the law, and that is how a man who tried to avoid noise ended up as a headline that outlived his own footsteps. The week of sentencing felt like a snowless winter, hushed and cold even when the sun hit the courthouse steps. Reporters waited with notebooks balanced on their knees, trading whispers about tapes, charts, and a verdict that reached from corner clubs to the heart of the city's construction trade. Inside, he sat with a posture that came from years of staying unflustered. He had lived by routines: morning coffee, afternoon meetings, late-night reviews built on the belief that patience outlasts pressure. Now the room turned toward him for an outcome that would erase those routines in a single breath. The judge read. The lawyers fixed their eyes, and the number landed like a thick door closing. Decades upon decades. A sentence long enough to outpace any calendar a man of his age could imagine. Everyone knew his nickname. Everyone knew the club. Now they knew the time. The case had been woven from strands collected over years. Federal agents joined city detectives, planted microphones in rooms where the air tasted of tobacco and coffee, photographed doorways where men leaned in to murmur agreements. The story they told in court matched what associates had lived for a generation. The Genovese family's Harlem crew, running numbers, bookmaking, loans, and protection. Union ties that shaped schedules, and an arrangement that defined who poured concrete on the largest projects in Manhattan. It wasn't the kind of crime that splashes red on a sidewalk. It was a toll, charged quietly and reliably. The jurors listened to translators explain simple words that carried complicated meanings. Package meant a cut. List meant an approved bidder. Friend meant an intermediary with instructions. The defense tried to pull those meanings back to earth, calling them ordinary chit-chat. The jury didn't buy it. He had met that moment while already living under a separate legal shadow. The government had held him without bail, not for fear of flight, but because, they argued, his freedom would allow ongoing economic harm. That argument made its way to the Supreme Court under his name. In a world where he avoided paperwork, it was an odd fate to become a citation. The justices sustained the law. Prosecutors could keep certain defendants in custody before trial if they persuaded a judge that public safety measured in dollars and disrupted markets as much as in bruises required it. Law schools added the case to their syllabi. In lockup, he received the news and lit no cigar. There were none to light. The trial itself was a map of how the city worked in the shadows during his prime. Numbers betting, once the heartbeat of Italian Harlem and nearby blocks, had been formalized into an operation with writers, runners, collectors, and a central bank where bets balanced and payouts got arranged. Bookmaking layered on top, handling sports seasons as a calendar for cash flow. Loans at punishing rates pinned borrowers into weekly obligations that rarely shrank. And over the last of his free decades, a more ambitious plan had linked those small-dollar routines to the biggest money in town. Skyscraper jobs. Agents called that segment the concrete scheme. A labor official, later convicted beside bosses, testified that he collected a fee per cubic yard poured on major sites and enforced a rotation among a short list of approved companies. Court papers labeled the list and the fee structure as part of a club that reached into several families. In that picture, Anthony Salerno's role wasn't muscle. It was stewardship. He sat where approvals got whispered. Names from other families filled the courtroom too, because the case aimed at the commission that once settled disputes and divided profits at the very top. The government laid tapes and documents from multiple corners of the city in front of jurors, so they could see an alliance that had survived for decades by avoiding wars and sharing markets. Co-defendants from other crews appeared in fits and starts on those recordings, discussing allocations and percentages like any group of executives carving up a field. To the press, the spectacle looked like a summit dragged out into public. To the men at the defense tables, it was the end of an era when most disputes had been kept off the front page. His lawyers tried to reduce his profile, arguing that he had become a symbol because he stayed visible at a social club while others hid. They said he was a local gambler who had aged into a grandfather figure, not the architect of a citywide cartel. They reminded jurors that New York has always suffered from job site chaos, union politics, and delivery headaches that had nothing to do with a conspiracy. But the tapes cut through those arguments. Even coded, the meetings sounded like direction. The government's charts, flashy and sometimes too neat for real life, nevertheless gave the jury a clean shape to hold on to. In a conspiracy trial, a clean shape often wins. After the verdict, prison replaced ceremony. He traded street clocks for count times and meal calls. In population, he could find a few old faces, men from other cases or other crews who were living out their final chapters on federal calendars. He kept his habits: quiet voice, steady manner, no complaints. Doctors saw him often. The strokes had left marks that staff recognized at a glance. The prison's medical wing became his world more than any yard or chapel. Newspapers came through with their delay and their funny smells, and he read them for stories about a city he had once helped organize one quiet decision at a time. Outside, cases kept spinning off the same core. Investigators widened their lens to public housing window contracts, a niche where prices could be nudged by locking in a few firms and blocking out rivals. The contracts ran into tens of millions, spread across boroughs. Prosecutors said the bidding system wasn't free at all. It was coordinated, with a cut traveling upward to families who treated city budgets like lifelines. His name surfaced again. Even from prison, he was tied to the period when those understandings were forged. That rolling scandal ended with convictions, and more time layered onto terms that already measured beyond any ordinary lifespan. The point wasn't additional years, he had more than enough. The point was to detail and punish the last corners of the empire that investigators believed he'd overseen. Somewhere between verdicts and appeals, another story broke the public version of his rank. Vincent Caffaro, once a loyal messenger and collector, sat with prosecutors and drew a different chart. In his telling, Vincent Gigante, reclusive, rarely recorded, fond of confusing onlookers, sat at the real top while Anthony served as a front. That account explained the Genovese family's resilience after headline arrests. The true boss didn't sit in the window. He stayed on the far side of the curtain, letting a familiar figure draw the lights and the heat. Law enforcement adjusted in response. Cases against Gigante rolled forward over time, complicated by his odd public persona. The correction didn't change Anthony's fate. The jury's verdicts rested on what he had done, not on whether he did it at someone else's quiet direction. But it did change the way people talked about him. He had been trusted enough to serve as the visible boss of a cautious family, and that meant something even if the ultimate voice belonged to another man. The old crew, the network of runners, collectors, property managers, and union friends who had reported to him, kept going without him, smaller and less confident. The state lottery had already eaten a chunk of the numbers play. Legal gambling that broadcast its drawings on television stole the ritual from stoops and storefronts, where numbers, writers, had once collected dimes and dollars with a neighbor's nod. Sports betting stayed strong but drifted as technology changed how wagers moved. Loans didn't vanish because hard times never do, yet banks and credit cards altered the landscape. Union strains continued, but federal oversight placed reformers in seats that had once been allocated by favors. The shift wasn't just legal, it was cultural. The city began to prefer sunlight over quiet nods, at least officially. In the windowless rooms where agents debriefed cooperators, They built timelines that reached back to the earliest years of his rise. There were the numbers halls that anchor the 116th Street legend, the bookmaking lines that turned a bar's back room into a switchboard, the pocket unions that developed private rules, the vending and jukebox routes that brought coins to counting tables, and the construction rackets that taught a generation of bosses the value of choke points. They reviewed old arrests that had drawn fines or short sentences, a gambling case here, a tax count there, and traced how those stumbles hadn't slowed him because the larger structure kept absorbing shocks. They returned to the social club, that door with tilted blinds and a coffee smell, because to understand Anthony's influence, you had to understand that public quiet can be the outer layer of a complex machine. No shouts, no dramatic displays, just steady control over who paid whom, when, and how much. People who knew him from the neighborhood rarely used the language that filled indictments. They talked about how he paid for a kid's hospital bill or arranged for a cousin's job on a crew. Favors grease every town, and East Harlem grew up on that logic. He built a system where favors had a price even if the price felt like gratitude at first. That duality defined him. He ran a broad criminal enterprise that treated industries as revenue sources. He also played the role of local patriarch, someone who returned calls and remembered faces. In a courtroom, the first truth swallows the second. On the block, the second sometimes masked the first for years. Reporters wrote profiles that wrestled with that contrast. They described the felt hats, the heavy cigars, the way he could sit for hours without moving more than his eyes. They walked past the club and described its tired paint and worn floor as if those details could decode the man. They called him a throwback, the last of a type. That language wasn't quite right. He had been a bridge, one foot in the neighborhood games of the old East Harlem, the other in a sophisticated extortion system that understood the value of union cards and bid lists. He wasn't a relic. He was adaptive. His property holdings became the most visible part of his legacy. Deeds, leases, rent, checks, those documents outlasted the wire rooms and betting slips that got raided or shredded. Tenants continued to pay months after his sentencing. Lawyers argued over forfeitures and liens as the government tried to peel assets away from the web of partners and shell companies that had held titles for years. You could measure a career like his in cash skimmed and envelopes collected. But you could also measure it in addresses. Buildings don't flee when agents knock. They get valued, attached, and fought over. He didn't grant interviews from prison. He didn't offer confessions or apologies. He had always believed that words create openings. Silence had served him, right up to the moment when microphones let other people fill the story. In the medical wing, staff saw a man whose life had been both hard and soft. Hard in results, soft in presentation. Visitors came less often as the years stacked up. Associates aged or passed. The city changed faster than the old men could track. He read about backroom bargains turning into press conferences. He read about reforms at unions that had once reported to him through intermediaries. He read about construction jobs bid under new transparency rules. And then he read about new scandals, because no system erases human weakness entirely. There is a way his life fits the city's rhythm even now. New York builds itself over and over again. Towers rise where breweries once stood. Ferries return to docks that sat idle. Subway lines extend, and neighborhoods trade one language for another without losing their corners. Underneath those cycles, someone always tries to take a piece at the choke points permits, deliveries, schedules, contracts. He didn't invent that urge. He shaped one chapter of it. For decades, he did it so quietly that most people in the neighborhood smiled at him as if he were just another local success story. The law eventually named it clearly. Racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, gambling, tax fraud, bid rigging. When you pull the curtain, the vocabulary changes. On paper, his crimes now look clinical, like a list in a textbook. In real time, they felt like a service to many who paid him or his men, because the city is a place where predictability is rare. He sold predictability. If you were a contractor, things went smoothly. If you were a bettor, your man was always there. If you were a borrower, you got cash when you needed it. The cost was hidden until it wasn't. That's the heart of his story. The way something that looks like order can be a mask for pressure. The way a neighborly nod can be a toll. He aged fast under fluorescent lights. He had entered prison already an old man by the standards of the life he'd led. The medical center kept him alive with the same routines that govern every patient, high profile or not. He carried his nickname like a coat other people insisted on seeing, but inside the walls, a nickname doesn't change the line at the pill window or the timing of a doctor's rounds. His lawyers visited with updates he could recite by heart before they started. Appeals closed. Motions failed. The law had done what the street had rarely managed. It had ended the routine for good. He would die before he saw certain institutions he'd influenced take another turn. But that part of the story belongs to the city, not to a single man. What belongs to him is the shape of his career. A climb from numbers runner to East Harlem crew boss. The expansion into bookmaking, loans and vending routes. The strategic move into unions and construction. The role as the visible leader of a family that preferred the real leader stay hidden. The famous bail case. The commission trial. The windows scandal. The long sentence. The quiet decline behind a locked door. He built a life on steadiness, on showing up at the same chair with the same cigar and the same expectation that everything would be handled without fuss. In the end, the fuss simply changed venue from a club where cards ticked softly on wood to a courtroom where a clerk's pen scratched a verdict into the record. Night in the prison hospital wing settled like a thin blanket, lights dimmed but never dark. A television whispering sports, scores to men who pretended not to listen. He kept his back against the pillows and scanned the day's paper with a slow finger, pausing over his own name the way a carpenter checks an old scar on a workbench. He had been written about for years as if he were a bronze statue on a neighborhood corner, something permanent and simple. But lives aren't statues. They bend. They hide. They deflect. He'd spent decades in rooms that carried the same coffee smell, the same card click, the same half sentences. Now the air smelled like disinfectant and laundry soap. The man who once set schedules for runners and collectors now lived by a bell that summoned medication and meals. He adapted, because adaptation had always been his edge, even when the choices were few. In those hours between count and lights out, memories lined up without asking permission. He could walk the old path in his mind from Italian Harlem stoops to the Palma Boys social club, past church steps where women traded recipes and men nodded in the quiet language of the block. He could still see first lessons learned as a teenager ferrying slips for neighborhood policy writers, absorbing the rhythms of the numbers game that paid out joy in bursts and disappointment in a steady drizzle. He learned who to trust and when to keep walking. That early schooling never ends, even after courts give it a name that lands a person in a chain of buses and cells. He had ascended not by shouting, but by absorbing detail and never dropping a ball. In the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, as bigger figures jostled for reach, he stepped into gaps with a patience that made older men notice. The 116th Street Crew was an institution long before his name reached the papers, a city inside the city with its own traffic rules. He kept books clean, paid up on time, and didn't make scenes. That was the currency that counted. The coin-op trade jukeboxes, pinball, cigarette machines added another layer. You placed machines where cash moved, earned a cut on every song and pack, and made sure no competitor walked in without an escort. That kind of work rewarded discipline, not noise. He had plenty of the first and no taste for the second. As the 1,960 seconds brought surveillance and racketeering laws into sharper use, he managed the pressure with the same steady routine. Say little, hire good lawyers, let fines and short sentences bounce off the larger structure, and return to the chair by the back wall where everyone knew to find him. The Palma Boys Social Club became more than a room. It was a message. I'm here. I'm steady. Bring it to me, and I'll sort it out. In a city that eats time and spits out chaos, steady is valuable. Writers and runners liked a boss who kept things predictable. Contractors liked a phone call that meant the job would go without interruptions. Union intermediaries liked someone who understood their calendars and their headaches. The shift from street money to citywide leverage came as New York's skyline changed. Concrete turned into index cards covered in phone numbers, bids, dates, and deliveries that had to hit an exact hour or an entire site would sit idle. Whoever could move that schedule could skim value without touching a brick. The group that held that choke point did not post signs. A union official collected fees, delivered messages, and kept a list short by design. Certain firms were approved for the biggest pours. Others got the leftovers or none at all. Bosses from multiple families met quietly to keep peace and divide the flow. His seat in those talks represented decades of delivered revenue and a reputation for keeping feathers unruffled while the till filled. Being called the top man often says more about who is visible than who is truly in charge. He sat where everyone could see him, a conscious risk in a family that preferred shadows. After Frank Thierry's death in 1981, the public story placed Anthony at the summit. He did what he'd always done, took the meetings, set terms, kept money moving, and accepted that visible rank draws attention that can turn fatal for either the body or the docket. Years later, when a trusted insider told prosecutors that another man, a phantom of sorts, actually held final say, the picture clarified the way a smudged photograph does after someone cleans the glass. By then, the cost had already been paid. He carried the heat because he could. The government had learned patience too. Agents logged plates outside the club, clipped microphones inside rooms that once felt safe, and sat with translators to decode ordinary words into the language of conspiracy. Those tapes became the backbone of cases that tied his name to a committee that rationed concrete, pressured contractors, and used union access as a lever. They reached into sports betting and numbers play not because those made headlines, those didn't. Not anymore, but because that daily river of cash explained how the rest could be funded and enforced. Juries heard a glossary that sounded laughably plain to outsiders. To insiders, it sounded exactly right. If you live in a world where you never say the thing itself still gets done. He took the commission trial like a man used to long games. If the jury believed that a board existed, and if they placed him at that board, then the result would be a sentence that outran age. That's exactly what happened. Sentencing turned a long, comfortable routine into a new, rigid one. He entered federal custody, with a pair of strokes already behind him. The Bureau of Prisons knew where to place him. Medical staff dealt with the remnants of his health problems, while lawyers finished the appeals that tried to poke holes in the government's clean-edged charts. The appeals failed. Judges wrote words that would stick longer than any headline. The law had captured a shape that the street had kept deliberately blurry. There was an odd chapter folded into those years, his name welded to a Supreme Court ruling that rebalanced bail hearings around the country. He had fought to be free pending trial, arguing that he posed no danger in the sense that most people recognize no threat of sudden violence. Prosecutors said danger includes economic harm, the slow bleed of money, and market confidence caused by orchestrated rackets. Justices agreed. United States v. Salerno became a citation that found its way into legal arguments far removed from numbers betting on a Harlem block. Inside, he shrugged at the irony that a man who worked so hard to stay out of print had become a bookmark for a legion of lawyers. Another case waited down the corridor. Public housing window contracts worth many millions. Investigators followed the same footprints, coordinated bids, prearranged winners. Prices padded by agreements made in quiet rooms. They alleged that the Genovese family and allies in other groups rotated victories while siphoning off money that should have gone to cheaper, clean bids. He wasn't standing in any hallway to deliver instructions by then, but prosecutors built the timeline and circled his years of influence. More charges followed. More time stacked onto a sentence already beyond normal reach. To him, the effect was symbolic. Time had already pinned him in place. To the government, the effect was structural. You name every corner of the system and nail them to the record. Life in the medical center operated on small routines. He liked the paper, even if it slanted and sneered. He sipped coffee when it was allowed and acceptable. He played cautious hands at cards with other old men, none of them interested in stories that could wake an investigator. He nodded at news of a new building going up where a factory used to stand and thought about how many schedules, unions, and trucking routes would have to mesh to make glass and steel stand that tall. He didn't brag. He didn't fume. The old code discouraged both. He simply let the day pass through him the way he used to let neighborhood weather pass while he sat barely moving at the back of the club. Back in the city, a neighborhood learned to live without him. The club door opened more often to curious onlookers than to men with business. Some regulars aged out, others moved on. Younger figures, hungry and restless, tried to copy old methods with new tools. Surveillance grew lighter in some corners and heavier in others. Unions took their turns under trusteeship, and reform. Concrete firms turned over names on their letterheads, while the men who made real choices changed faces and phone numbers. The city, as always, adjusted. That adjustment didn't absolve the past. It just wrote the next chapter with different pens. Friends and family visited with the slow cadence of people who know time is both short and long. They brought gossip, photographs, jokes told twice to fill awkward pauses. He received them with the same mix of warmth and reserve that had made him attractive to earners and exasperating to agents. If visitors pushed for reflections, he offered deflection. He'd built a life on not narrating it. He let others tell his story, then sat and listened as if he were just another reader. Old associates who had managed to avoid charges sent regards through intermediaries. Some of those messages were sincere. Some were a way of closing a book. The people who had owed him money, or protection, or quiet help in an emergency, found other desks to knock on. That was always going to happen. Crews replace bosses because the market for favors never sleeps. What he had sold for decades was predictability. The city rarely delivers that. He had offered it in return for loyalty and a cut, for a price that hid behind courtesy. Borrowers remembered the first envelope, the one that arrived like rain on a parched day. Contractors remembered the call that made picket signs vanish, as if someone had turned off a switch. Bookies remembered that collections came like clockwork. The price for those miracles had been argued in a courtroom for months, and stamped on a judgment for 100 years. In those quiet nights, he sometimes stepped back even further, to the texture of the old neighborhood before the papers turned his name into shorthand for a whole family. Church bells, boys in rolled-up sleeves leaning against hydrants, mothers calling from windows, a barber sweeping hair into neat piles as if a street could be groomed into order. He had loved that order homegrown, unsentimental, merciless in its own way. He learned to translate it into ledgers and lists, into schedules that made men feel safe even as they surrendered choices. If you are going to live in a city that thrums and bucks, safety is worth more than interest on a loan. He understood that instinct, and built a career on it. There were no grand epiphanies. He didn't recast himself as a penitent. The cold accounting of the law had its own power. Convictions for racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to restrain trade, illegal gambling, tax matters, and the wire and mail counts that often ride behind such work. The story those counts told was plain. He had run and supervised systems that took money from vices the city tolerated and from industries it could not run without. He had made both look like ordinary business. In the twilight of his life, it fell to jailers and nurses to take care of the daily business of keeping him alive and comfortable. He who had arranged care for so many, the envelope for someone's sick mother, the quick call to help a friend's son, now lived on a care schedule that belonged to a bureaucracy. The cops who had parked across from the Palma Boys social club sometimes visited his file in their own minds. They'd recall the steady parade of men into that dim room, and the feeling that a city they loved was being taxed by people who never asked for votes. They'd recall the day indictments came down, and the feeling of pulling a thread that finally yanked a well-tailored sleeve. Those officers retired, new ones arrived, and the cycle that had made him both necessary and dangerous continued with different names. The city can't erase its appetite for private order. It can only struggle to keep that appetite inside rules that protect the many from the few. His legacy was complicated because he designed it that way. He wanted to be seen as a neighborhood man who took phone calls and returned favors. He also wanted to be taken seriously by the most sophisticated earners in the underworld, the ones who treated unions as instruments and markets as puzzles. He succeeded on both fronts. That success drew the kind of attention that leads to a bus ride with chains skimming an ankle. He died with a reputation that still creates arguments in barber chairs and law school classrooms. Was he the boss or the stand-in? Was he a ruthless extortionist or a calm manager who kept a lid on chaos? The records say he was all of those things, and that the labels matter less than the results. He knew results. For half a century he had boosted and skimmed, mediated and taxed, invested and laundered, always with an eye on the next day's collections. He understood that crime at scale looks less like a fistfight and more like a spreadsheet. He organized a private budget for a slice of New York and treated stability as a product he could sell. That product turned into exhibits and incarceration when the city finally decided it wanted to see the machinery. Even then, even after the big trial, he kept his way. Sit, listen, answer in short phrases, never give a headline a new angle. He had outlasted many storms by trusting his routine. In the end, a storm arrived that was bigger than his routine could handle. Every life leaves a footprint in places that never make the news. Some of the buildings he owned still stand, producing rent checks that now route to entities that fought the government over who held true title. Some of the people he helped in small ways still feel a tug of loyalty when they pass the spot where the club used to cast its rectangle of light onto the sidewalk at dusk. Some former borrowers now old themselves, still hear in their sleep the knock they dreaded once a week on the day interest came due. And in courtrooms far from East Harlem, lawyers still cite a case with his name when arguing over whether a defendant should sleep at home or on a plastic mattress under buzzing lights. That is how a life like his echoes, not as a single note, but as ripples across different ponds. If you stood with him in those final years, you might not see a villain or a folk hero. You'd see an old man whose hands shook a little, who tilted his head to catch every word, who remembered every corner he'd ever turned, in a city that grows over its own past like ivy. You'd see a planner at the end of his calendar, living on another institution's time, still stubborn about certain habits, still quiet when talk would only make things worse. He had ordered so much, yet accepted the things he couldn't order in the end. When the door locked, when the nurse arrived, when the mail cart rolled by with a newspaper that carried his name as if it belonged to the city rather than to him. Rain traced slow lines on the narrow window of the medical ward, the kind of steady drizzle that makes a day feel suspended, neither beginning nor ending. He watched it without comment, as a nurse checked his pulse and tucked a paper cup of pills into his palm. On the rolling news at low volume, a pundit argued about bail policy and cited a case that carried his name as if it were a statute carved in stone. He listened the way he always had, quietly, absorbing what mattered, discarding what didn't. The city outside that window kept moving, cranes swinging over old factory lots, concrete trucks finding their lanes, unions holding meetings where men in clean shirts talked about hours and jurisdiction. He had shaped pieces of that world for a very long time, and now sat still, tethered to routines that didn't belong to him anymore. The paperwork never seemed to stop. Even after the big verdicts, lawyers filed motions that tried to chip at edges, health-based releases, claims that certain recordings were misinterpreted, questions about whether the government's charts simplified a messy city into a neat conspiracy. He read the summaries and let the pages rest on his lap. A second trial about public contracts had already added years that no calendar could carry. The story there echoed the older one. Bids coordinated by a small circle. Contracts for window replacements priced above what an open market might have produced. Union leverage used as a gate. His name linked to meetings where markets were shaped, not by open debate, but by understandings that traveled from back table to job site. The result was the same: more time in a system that measured days by count and call. He often thought about how the smallest parts of his life's work had taught him the most. The numbers trade policy, as the old-timers called it, was the city's first lesson in scale. You could walk a single block and hear three people whisper their combination, each convinced this was the day a dream or a street sign or a birth date would turn into cash. Writers took those bets with pencils dulled to nubs, and runners carried stacks of slips to banks that balanced risk by comparing totals across neighborhoods. He learned to see that river of tiny wagers as a single flow that could be directed, protected, and skimmed. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't harmless. It was discipline, and it proved that a city's appetite, properly organized, could make a small office into an engine. Loans taught a different lesson. People came when their car broke down, when rent landed hard, when a hospital bill turned a paycheck into a joke. He gave cash at rates that made the first week feel like rescue, and the 10th feel like a trap. The math stayed the same no matter the decade. A percentage on top of a percentage, collected on a schedule that respected nothing but itself. He didn't scream to collect. He didn't have to. Timidabbles and reputations did that work. In courtrooms, those accounts became exhibits. In real life, they were the gears that made everything else turn payoffs, lawyer retainers, envelopes for men in positions to make small problems vanish. Sports made the year a rotation of peaks and valleys. Football Sundays, basketball midweeks, baseball on summer evenings, fights that brought bettors out of the woodwork, each with a pattern of action that could be read like a farmer reads weather. He kept the action balanced, laid off risk when it spiked, and relied on books that tracked every bettor's history to anticipate who was chasing and who was walking away until next season. People remember spectacular events, but money remembers routine. He made sure routines paid, and he made sure they paid up. Then there were the machines, jukeboxes that filled bars with sound, pinball, and later video games that gobbled quarters, cigarette racks that clicked open with a metal sigh. You didn't just place a machine, you claimed a corner. A bar that took your jukebox kept your vending, and anyone who tried to switch suppliers learned why relationships mattered. Those routes were small empires that trained men to keep accounts, to fix problems before they made noise, and to know which bar owner needed a break because a child was sick. They also served as an introduction to a rule that only grew more valuable as he climbed. Control access, control income. Labor sharpened that rule into a tool. Unions set who worked, when they worked, and under what conditions. Local bosses and business agents controlled those levers day by day. If you had allies in those rooms, you could smooth problems that would cripple a job site slowdowns, sudden disputes, inspectors arriving at the worst possible moment. He didn't storm union halls. He sent people who knew how to listen, who understood calendars and grievance procedures, who could solve something on a Thursday evening before it turned into a Monday disaster. Those relationships weren't charity. They were investments paid back in direct deposits of influence. Construction became the apex because it fused every principle he'd learned at smaller scales. A skyscraper does not rise because steel and concrete exist. It rises because a schedule holds. Whoever can guarantee a schedule can tax it. He sat in rooms where a short roster of concrete firms got the nod for the biggest pours. A fee per yard traveled upward, distributed by rules no one wrote down but everyone knew. Union officers enforced calm at the sites that mattered most. Contractors who didn't want to pay learned the difference between a plan and a guess. The arrangement never needed a billboard. It needed discipline and a handful of men who trusted that discipline more than they craved headlines. For a long stretch, he was one of those men. The investigators who finally disentangled those threads weren't superhuman, they were patient. They sat in cars. They logged plates. They drank terrible coffee in apartments across from storefronts with drawn shades. They found people willing to wear wires. They planted microphones where the air smelled like stale smoke and old wood. They got promoted, retired, were replaced by new faces who kept adding pages until a story emerged that a jury could hold in its hands. They had help from a law that let them tell bigger stories. The racketeering statute, which treated an enterprise as a single creature fed by many acts. The tapes helped too. When jurors heard men speak in euphemisms, translators explained how ordinary words carried agreed meanings. It wasn't a perfect mirror of reality, but it was close enough to make verdicts feel inevitable once the first domino fell. He knew better than to underestimate the power of a man who decides to talk. When Vincent Cafaro started cooperating, he redrew a map that had been presented to the public one way while operating another. The Genovese habit of putting a visible leader in the window while the true boss stayed out of sight turned out to be real, not a rumor. Cafaro said Anthony's role fit that design. Front man, not final word. That revelation changed prosecutions built for the future. It didn't change the past. The acts that put him inside, organizing gambling, running loan books, steering construction markets, shaping union influence, stood on their own, regardless of who could overrule him in a room without a microphone. Behind all of that was a less glamorous but equally important part of the story. Paperwork with his name on it for properties that looked exactly like what they were: apartment houses, garages, small warehouses, storefronts. Over time, those deeds became a second spine for his finances. Rent arrived whether a bet hit or missed. Leases spoke a language that judges understood. When the government came for those addresses, they had to follow rules too. Liens, forfeiture hearings, arguments about beneficial owners, and shell companies that held title. The fights were technical, sometimes boring, often bitter. They showed how a man who made his living in cash understood the value of cash's opposite, a check that lands on a predictable day from a predictable tenant. In the neighborhoods where he had grown up, none of those pieces looked like a master plan. They looked like a way to keep the block from spinning out. People told stories about him that made him sound like a neighborhood fixer. The envelope for a funeral, the quiet pull to get a nephew union work, the way he could take a small beef and turn it into a handshake. Those stories were true and incomplete. The same network that delivered favors charged for them with interest that didn't always come in dollars. Loyalty was currency. Access was currency. Silence was currency. He traded in all three. He made no speeches in prison. He didn't turn pious or bitter. He stuck to the habits that had protected him. Listen more than talk. Answer less than is asked. Let other people soak up the desire to perform. Guards saw an older man with a steady manner and a medical chart that grew heavier with each checkup. Other inmates saw someone who didn't need to tell stories to feel important. He had lived his stories, and they had brought him where he was. He didn't advertise. The legal world would keep saying his name in contexts that had nothing to do with Harlem or concrete. The bail case that set a national precedent followed him like a shadow. Judges used it when deciding whether to keep white-collar defendants inside because their freedom might threaten markets rather than people's bodies. Defense lawyers tried to narrow it. Legislatures tinkered with statutes that sat under it. He watched those debates from a room where lights never truly went out and felt the oddness of a life spent avoiding the spotlight rebounding as theory and principle. You could map the arc of his years against the city's own. He was born into a time when Prohibition had just ended, and the old street games were reorganizing under calmer rules. He rose with a crew that made policy a neighborhood ritual and cut the proceeds into slices that kept money moving up and down. He matured when jukeboxes turned change into revenue, and unions made the difference between a job opening and staying home. He reached his greatest influence when New York decided to rebuild itself in glass and steel and needed concrete to arrive exactly when forms and rebar said it should. He fell when the tools of that era, wiretaps, bugs, RICO, let agents turn a city's unwritten code into a story a jury could follow line by line. Through it all, he avoided being the sort of man who frightened children or courted attention. His heft and his cigar gave him a recognizable shape. His manner gave people a sense that things would be handled without drama. That steadiness was both shield and trap. It shielded him because he didn't panic, and because many people preferred quiet solutions. It trapped him because visibility and reliability drew eyes, cameras, and microphones. The Genovese family's preference for a front boss meant those eyes landed on him even when another man murmured the final yes or no. He accepted that because acceptance was part of how he had always kept balance. This is the job. Do it. When he thought about his own crimes because a man sitting alone in a medical ward thinks about what he has done, he did not need a prosecutor to lay them out. He had overseen illegal gambling that turned hope into rent money when luck struck and into habit when it didn't. He had run loan games that turned emergencies into long relationships with a payment schedule that never smiled. He had participated in extortion schemes that taxed industries concrete, trucking, windows where public money and private ambition met. He had used union influence to steer outcomes that should have been decided in open rooms. He had kept some streets safer by a certain definition and made the city more expensive by another. He didn't write lists or apologize to the air. He watched rain on the window and let the inventory pass through him. There were days when visits stacked up and days when the chair beside his bed sat empty. He took both the same way. Time had stopped being something he could manage. Outside, old addresses changed hands. The club where he had spent so many days turned into a place people walked past as if it were a museum of a city that no longer existed. Men he had known as kids carried their own gray hair and their own burdens into middle age. Some of them built straight businesses on the bones of places where his crew had once collected. Some of them slipped into newer schemes, refurbished versions of the old ones with digital tools as substitutes for payphones and paper slips. On some afternoons, a guard with a Queen's accent would talk baseball with him while switching bottles or checking a chart. Box scores turned into a neutral ground where hierarchy melted away and the day went faster. He liked that. It reminded him of long ago afternoons at the club, when a game on the radio filled the gaps between conversations that mattered and ones that didn't. Even in a medical wing, the rhythm of a season could lend a man a sense that time still moved forward rather than simply circling. He didn't plan a last act. The system he had helped build didn't have curtain calls. It had successors. The 116th Street crew kept its name and found new hands. The family found new patterns for leadership, repeating the old trick of putting one person under the light to protect the one who stood deeper in the room. Investigations returned in waves because demand and opportunity never aligned perfectly with law. His absence mattered and didn't, the way any one stone matters to a wall. He had been important. The structure had been bigger than him. A younger prosecutor once said after a hearing that the city would be better when men like him were gone. In a narrow sense, the prosecutor was right. The hidden taxes on contracts and the private rules that set who could work where cost the public more than they understood. In another sense, new names always arrive to chase the same leverage points. That cycle isn't an excuse. It is the landscape. He had navigated it with a style that suited his temperament. Patient, methodical, invested in quiet. That style carried him far and finally wore thin against a different kind of patience. The kind that sits with a notebook in a car night after night waiting for a moment that adds a tile to a mosaic. Near evening, when the hallway thinned and the television poured out a glow that made the room feel smaller, he would close his eyes and walk the old streets in his head. The stoops were there, the barbers sweeping up, the baker carrying racks to cool by open doors, the club's back table waiting. He followed that route partly because memory is a gentler companion than the present, and partly because those places were the map of his life whether he liked it or not. He had taken an ordinary neighborhood education and turned it into a system that touched city budgets and corporate ledgers. He had called it taking care of business. The law had called it racketeering. Both descriptions told part of the truth. He slept lightly, the way a man learns to sleep after decades of listening for knocks or news, and woke to the same soft buzz of fluorescent light that marked every morning. The nurse returned with her cart, a paper cup, a nod. He let the pills sit on his tongue and sipped water. On the screen, a city council member spoke about ethical contracting and transparency rules. The words sounded clean, full of promise. He had heard similar speeches before, separated by eras and names. If the city had a constant, it was ambition. Ambition built towers and schemes with equal energy. He had ridden that energy as long as anyone could ride it. Now he watched it from a bed with rails, as distant from the center of decisions as he had once been close. The rain let up by afternoon, leaving the sky the pale color of paper. He folded the newspaper along its creases and set it aside. He was not a man given to grand pronouncements. He had lived in such a way that other people filled silences with guesses about what he thought. In those hours between checks, with the room quiet and the hallway calm, he allowed himself a simple admission. He had wanted control, and he had found it by giving others a sense that their own lives would move more smoothly if they trusted him. That bargain had worked until it didn't. It had paid men, and it had cost the city. It had kept order on certain corners and created imbalance in places most people never see. He didn't ask for forgiveness from a ceiling tile. He didn't rewrite himself as a misunderstood businessman. He accepted the ledger and let the day thin out toward evening. Morning rounds came with the squeak of rubber soles and a nurse's calm voice, the kind of routine that turns days into a measured line. He watched the cart stop at each bed and thought about a different line, the one that used to run from a club door in East Harlem to truck yards, union halls, and job site trailers. Outside the fence, arguments about bail, corruption, and reform kept using his name as a touchstone. Inside, a paper cup and a folded newspaper marked the start of another day. He took the pills, skimmed the headlines, and found the familiar mix of nostalgia and calculation a man carries when his world has been reduced but his memory has not. Letters still arrived. Some came from relatives who cared more about his health than about court results. Others came from old associates using careful language, the sort of phrasing that says plenty without saying anything that can be read into a microphone. They shared neighborhood news: who had moved to Florida, which bakery changed hands, who had a grandchild on the way. Now and then a paragraph slipped in about a union election or a city contract, couched as gossip. He read every line, not because he could act on any of it, but because a man who spent a lifetime absorbing small signals does not unlearn the habit. Lawyers visited and recapped the furniture of his legal life. The commission trial had ended years earlier with a sentence meant to be symbolic and practical at once, too long for any man of his age to outlast, clear enough to warn anyone who still thought the old system could operate without consequence. The bail ruling that carried his name had become a staple of arguments all over the country. A few lawyers still wanted to test its limits. They told him about fresh cases that cited it, about judges who read it differently, about defense teams trying to persuade courts that economic harm should not count the same way as a fist. He listened, nodded, and let the topic recede. The irony had long ago settled into a fact. His life in the shadows had given the law a headline that never stopped echoing. Another case had also ridden alongside the big one, the story about the city's window replacement program. Investigators said a small ring of companies rotated wins on public housing contracts worth many millions, with prices lifted by a private agreement that stretched across more than one family. Witnesses described how bids were shaped before envelopes were opened, how union influence swayed schedules, how money flowed upward in a quiet stream that felt almost routine to the people inside it. He wasn't walking into any office to set terms when that case ripened. He was already serving time. But prosecutors drew a line through years of meetings and said his influence had helped build the culture that made the scheme possible. Convictions followed, and the judge added more years. They were mostly symbolic against the mountain already on him, yet the symbolism mattered. It put a number on a practice that had for too long been treated like background noise. Details from the concrete case kept resurfacing in the press whenever new towers went up. Reporters loved the idea that a group of men in modest rooms could tax the skyline. They wrote about the list of favored concrete firms and the fee per yard that, according to trial testimony, traveled from site to office to back room with a clockmaker's regularity. They named the union official who collected it and put his face on the same page as bosses from different families, creating a portrait of a committee that had traded open warfare for split markets. They wrote about S and a concrete, about the suggestion that he had a hidden interest in a company that seemed to land big pours again and again. His lawyers hated those stories because the details never lined up perfectly with the record, and yet the outline was close enough to become common knowledge. In crime, the outline is often what outlives the footnotes. The tapes made it easy to draw that outline. Bugs in cars and clubs captured talk that, to an untrained ear, sounded like nothing. Analysts taught jurors to hear it differently. When someone said a job was for our friends, the translation came with charts and context. When someone said a list was settled, the presentation showed which firms got calls and which did not. He had spent a lifetime avoiding labels even as he sat in the most public chair in the room. The tapes gave him labels he never would have accepted out loud. They also gave the government a way to turn half sentences into findings. Even if, as every veteran will tell you, coded talk can be messy, and interpreters sometimes press meanings too hard. The verdict said the translations were good enough. His body kept its own schedule, one the prison doctors could chart without needing a stethoscope. The strokes from his last years on the street had left their signatures. Walking required short bursts with a hand on a rail. Speech carried a tiny delay, as if words needed an extra jog before they reached daylight. He adapted. He always had. Routine became a raft. He liked a certain chair in the day room, a certain time for coffee, a certain page in the paper read first. People think of prisons as places where authority comes from shouts. In a medical wing, it comes from lists and clocks. He read those lists the way he'd once read job site schedules. With respect for the damage a missed hour can cause, from time to time, he let himself replay the long climb. The numbers work in Italian Harlem was where craft took root. He had worked for older men whose names rarely made print, learning to count collections without dropping a step, learning faces and habits, and the 1,000 tiny exceptions that make a neighborhood run. He had learned to spot a runner who would keep a clean book and a borrower who would turn into a problem. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from lectures. It comes from years of small decisions. He carried that approach into every new field. Vending routes, sports betting, loans, and eventually labor and construction. Steady hands rise, because other people like to hand them problems. The East Harlem room where he became a fixture, the Palma Boys Social Club, kept turning up in magazines as a symbol. Writers treated it like a stage set, with blinds tilted just so, and chairs placed as if to cue a scene. They didn't get that the room's power came from what didn't happen there as much as from what did. There were no speeches, no chest thumping. The rhythm was simple. Arrivals, quiet conversations, departures. Money followed that rhythm, and so did decisions. People later recalled the cigar smoke and the slow nods because those are details a reader can picture. What they were really remembering was the comfort of a system that hid rough edges behind predictability. He had taken that comfort and sold it to the city's biggest industry. If you could guarantee that concrete arrived on time, that pickets stayed home, that deliveries didn't get lost at a yard on the day a pour was set, then a developer would pay for that guarantee. That was the logic of the concrete club described in court. A small roster of firms secured the big jobs, a per-yard tax went to people who made interference disappear, and union contacts ensured job sites stayed orderly. It wasn't about one dramatic moment. It was about hundreds of quiet steps executed in the right order. The public didn't see those steps. It saw glass and steel rise, and assumed that steady work meant fair work. He knew better, and so did the agents who eventually built a map tight enough to hold up in front of a jury. Behind the concrete story lived other levers, trucking routes that needed to cross certain docks without delays, Teamsters locals that controlled who drove and when, which mattered when a project ran on a razor-thin timeline, carpenters and laborers whose jurisdiction battles could stall a floor for a week if not handled. He wasn't the only man touching those strings, and he knew not to pull so hard that people got hurt in public view. That restraint was not compassion, it was strategy. The city tolerates certain secrets as long as they keep chaos low. His talent was finding that tolerance and living inside it. The shift that undid him wasn't just legal. Culture changed. Television turned old neighborhood legends into nightly serials. Reporters learned the vocabulary and the roots from newsroom veterans who had been around since the Kayfaber days. Politicians learned that there was appetite for stories about cleaning up bids and cutting hidden taxes. The state lottery ate away at street numbers. Casinos upstate, and in neighboring states, chipped at the bookmaking market. Credit cards and new kinds of loans dulled the sharp edge of old-school lending, even if they came with their own traps. By the time the government set its sights on the commission as a legal entity, and not just as a rumor, the city was already halfway out of the world he had mastered. One afternoon, a guard asked him about a line from the commission trial, the one where a union man described collecting a fee per cubic yard for the biggest jobs. The guard had heard the quote on a documentary and wanted to know if it sounded true. He didn't confirm or deny. He said the simplest thing a man like him could say without lying. Order costs money in a city that resists order. The guard laughed and said that sounded like something a judge would write. And then he moved on to the next bed with the same smooth efficiency that makes institutions function. There were still rumors that circled his name even after years away from the street. People who had moved into his old neighborhoods told reporters that the club had been the real mayor of those blocks, that nothing happened without a nod from the men inside. Others insisted that he had been a simple gambler given a costume by the press. The truth sat in the middle, as it usually does. He had controlled games that felt like tradition to people who played them. He had extended that control into places where tradition isn't a defense. He had invested in property because it makes the right kind of noise on paper. He had kept a family's reputation for caution intact by staying visible and predictable, while someone else, if the cooperators are to be believed, kept final authority at one remove. He kept his temper even when profile simplified him. He had never been a grandstander. The nickname followed him, and he refused to feed it. To a certain kind of reader, a heavy man with a cigar fits a caricature too easily. He used that for cover when it suited him, and ignored it when it didn't. The people who mattered to him were the ones who sat across a table and talked about money, schedules, and outcomes without raising their voices. Those conversations had made him who he was. They had also drawn microphones. You cannot be the person everyone visits and expect never to be photographed. His closest brush with bitterness came not from the length of the sentence or the ache in the joints, but from seeing how quickly markets adjust. The replacement windows kept getting installed. Concrete trucks kept arriving at dawn. The city declared reforms, and some stuck, and some did not. New faces learned old patterns, sometimes with better manners, sometimes with new tools. That truth wasn't an argument for what he had done. It was a weather report. He had lived long enough to know that the rain does not fall because a man likes or dislikes it. Visitors occasionally asked about the front boss story, the idea that he had been put in the window to protect a quieter leader. He deflected, because people who explain that kind of thing are the reason trials get scheduled. But the arc of later prosecutions suggested that the cooperators hadn't told a fairy tale. Vincent Gigante, the shadow most often named in those accounts, became a public case down the line, his own performances and hospital stays turning into a legal chess match. That sequence fit with the family's long preference for layered power. A face the world recognizes, a voice the world rarely hears. As months turned into years, he divided days into small segments, and gave each one a job. Mornings were for reading, and the short walk a therapist insisted upon. Midday brought coffee, always the small pleasure that kept him anchored. Afternoon meant a nap if the ward was quiet, a baseball conversation if the guard with the Queen's voice came by, or letters if the cart held any with his name. Evenings belonged to memory, because there is no television program that can compete with the city of a man's youth. He walked those blocks in his head and measured the distance between what was sold as neighborly order and what the law eventually proved to be extortion rackets wrapped in familiarity. He did not rewrite history for himself. The list of crimes attached to his name: illegal gambling, loans at crushing rates, racketeering across industries, extortion through union control, bid rigging on public projects, tax offenses. The communications charges that accompany organized work stood without spin. He could admit the list internally and still remember that many people on those blocks thought of him as a man who solved problems. That is how such systems survive. They meet a need and charge dearly for it while calling the bill something like respect. On a late winter day, a chaplain stopped by and spoke in plain language about peace and responsibility. The chaplain didn't push. He had learned that older men who have lived by a code feel insulted when a stranger arrives with a book and a script. They talked instead about habit and patience, about what it means to carry a reputation that grew larger than any one person. He said little, then thanked the chaplain for the visit because courtesy had always been part of his armor. When the door closed, he stared at the window and let the silence return. He had organized lives for better for some, worse for others, for half a century. The law had organized his last years in return. What survived in public long after that day were a handful of images and a handful of sentences. The images: a felt hat, a cigar, a club with a name that sounded like a boys' team, a courthouse corridor full of cameras, a wheelchair pushed by a marshal after a long hearing. The sentences: an appellate judge explaining preventive detention in a paragraph destined for casebooks, a trial judge setting out why hidden taxes on concrete were more than a nuisance, a cooperator explaining how decisions move down a chain without appearing on any memo. Those fragments formed an outline that school kids could recite in a classroom years later. They also formed the edges of a man whose real story was quieter, messier, and, in the end, sealed by the fact that he had let others do most of the talking even when the microphones were his undoing. Spring crept back despite the bland sameness of institutional time. Sunlight reached deeper into the room. The nurse opened the blinds a notch wider. He held a newspaper that ran a photo essay on the new towers at the Hudson and shook his head at the numbers on the price tags, the kind of math that would have amazed the young runner carrying slips up tenement stairs. The city had grown taller and costlier. The pressure points had shifted. The appetite for leverage hadn't. He set the paper down and folded his hands. Another day had made its measured turn. He had once been the man who kept other people's days on track, who sold predictability as if it were a product. Now he took it in the form of a schedule posted on a wall, a trade as old as any in his world. Summer pressed itself against the window screens, light pooling on the floor in a narrow strip that shifted by inches through the day. He dozed and woke in cycles, the way older bodies do, alert to footsteps in the hall, to the hush of voices, to the clink of cups on a metal tray. Somewhere far away, a broadcaster mentioned his name while talking about bail, then moved on to a story about a riverfront tower with a concrete frame rising one floor each week. He watched the shadows slide and let memory unspool without reaching for it. The years had taught him that a person is a sum of repeated choices. His choices had been steady ones, quiet, deliberate, aimed at control. Control had carried him from a boy with errands in his pocket to a man who sat at the center of a neighborhood economy. It had also carried him into courtrooms where that economy received a different name. People who knew only the headline sometimes asked how it started, as if there had been a single decision that set everything in motion. It wasn't like that. It was accumulation. A teenage runner for policy writers learned when to knock and when to wait, learned routes and faces, learned to keep a pencil sharp and a book clean. A collector learned to listen and to read the difference between a stall and a crisis. A supervisor learned to knit those moving parts into a pattern. Gambling, loans, vending, sports action, each piece had its own clock, its own risks, its own way of rewarding patience. He discovered early that the city hates a gap. If you could fill one, deliver cash on short notice, keep a game honest enough to survive, make a job site run, people tolerated your cut because you gave them something they could count on. He never called it racketeering. He called it keeping order. Prosecutors called it what the statute called it: an enterprise built on illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, bid rigging, and long-term control of labor levers that should have belonged to members and bylaws rather than to a handful of men. The tapes and ledgers said he coordinated numbers and sports books across East Harlem and the Bronx, kept loan accounts that punished missed weeks, and helped maintain a system that taxed concrete pours on major sites. Witnesses in later cases said window contracts for public housing had been steered the same way favored firms rotating wins, while union influence kept schedules obedient. Tax counts and the communications charges that ride behind conspiracies rounded out the ledgers. He had not invented any of it. He had made it work, and for a long stretch, he made it work quietly. Visibility remains a strange part of his legacy. He was the man the neighborhood saw, and the one agents filmed through a telephoto lens at the door of a small club. That made him important in two different ways. In the daily world of runners and collectors, he was the reliable center. In the legal world that gathered around him later, he was the symbol who made a complicated system legible to jurors, a single face attached to a set of tapes and charts. Cooperators would say that the true boss had been a different man, a figure rarely recorded and often out of view. Their account fit the family's preference for layered leadership. He didn't contradict it or endorse it because he had lived long enough to know that explanations break more than they mend. The record held what it held: meetings, approvals, envelopes, a cut per yard poured on the city's biggest jobs, and his consistent presence in the rooms where quiet decisions were made. That record produced a sequence no one in his world could ignore. First came the commission trial, and its 100-year sentences for leaders from more than one family, including him. The tapes from clubs and restaurants turned half sentences into exhibits. Jurors believed that the commission existed, and that it had fixed markets and steered unions. Sentencing arrived with a gravity that made even seasoned reporters set down their pens. Then came the decision that fixed his name in another place entirely: the Supreme Court opinion that allowed judges to detain certain defendants before trial if the government showed danger not only in violence, but in economic harm. United States v. Endes. Salerno moved his name from tabloids to law books, where it still sits, part of arguments far removed from Harlem card tables. After that, the Windows case added years that no human lifespan could spend. Prosecutors traced collusive bidding and said it flowed from the same culture of control. Convictions followed. Appeals did not rescue him. The law had spoken in complete sentences where he had spent decades speaking in hints. The city he had once managed by persuasion and routine did not stop for any of this. It never does. East Harlem changed its storefronts and its language, and then changed them again. The club that had functioned as his office became a landmark for photographers, and then a non-story for neighbors with other concerns. Unions shifted, some under trusteeship, some under reformers who wanted to draw a line under the past. Construction kept its schedule with new rules and new oversight, and then because people are people, other schemes tried to form in other shadows. The state lottery had long ago stripped daily numbers of their under-the-table glamour. Bookmaking found new channels in new technologies. Loan traps took digital forms that didn't require a collector to knock. The old world did not vanish so much as it dissolved and reassembled in different shapes. Inside the Federal Medical Center, his days narrowed. The city's hum arrived through newspapers and a television mounted high on a wall. Conversations with doctors and guards took the place of the soft back and forth he once held across a table with a cigar resting in an ashtray. He stuck to small rituals: the second cup of coffee if the nurse looked the other way, the order in which he read sections of the paper, the slow walk mapped by tiles on the floor. Visitors brought fragments of the outside birth announcements, obituaries, a union election, a name he hadn't heard in years. He nodded and tucked each detail away. A man who spent his life reading signs never stops reading, even when he can no longer act on what they say. He kept an internal count as well, a ledger written in memory. Born in 1911 to immigrants who carved a life out of the tight blocks of Italian Harlem. A teenager running slips for the policy game that paid out hope in 3 digits. A young man trusted with collections because he didn't lose his temper and didn't lose his place in a list. A middle-aged boss who could move from numbers to jukebox routes to sports books without dropping a beat. An older figure seated at the back of a club whose routine made other people feel safe enough to spend and borrow and build. A defender of a system that sold order by charging a toll. A defendant at the center of cases that forced a city to see what it had tolerated. And finally, a federal inmate whose health required a wing where days unfold under the soft buzz of lights. Facts, when stripped of their story, are stark. He had overseen illegal gambling rackets that stretched for decades. He had run loan books that produced steady income at steep human cost. He had taken a seat in arrangements that extracted money from construction and public contracts by controlling access and schedules. He had cultivated ties to union officers who could smooth problems or create them and use those relationships to steer outcomes. He had invested in property to ground cash in rents and deeds. He had faced indictments for racketeering and conspiracy, for extortion tied to industries, for gambling and tax counts, for mail and wire charges attached to coordinated schemes. He had fought for pretrial release and lost, leaving behind a legal rule that endures. He had become, by design and by circumstance, the person people knew to visit when they needed either a favor or a warning. None of that required dramatics. It required discipline. The last chapter arrived without spectacle. He was 80 when his body finally insisted on closing the book in the federal medical facility in Missouri, where the Bureau of Prisons sends men whose cases are larger than their remaining strength. The news traveled through wires and wires again. The age, the place, the cause, summed up in a single calm sentence. No microphones waited at a church door. No speeches were offered on courthouse steps. The city took note, turned the page, and returned to its permanent work of building and arguing and forgetting and remembering. He left behind a paper trail more visible than any he would have chosen. Published opinions, trial transcripts, property records, photographs of a door on a Harlem block. He also left behind a city that had learned from his era, sometimes the right lessons and sometimes the wrong ones. In the neighborhoods where his name still sparks opinions, people argue over what he was. Some say caretaker. Some say parasite. Many say both, because both can be true at once. He filled needs and charged more than a fair price. He kept certain corners calm and made the city pay more for concrete and windows than it should have. He remembered people's names and turned favors into obligations that could last years. He sold predictability to contractors and bettors and borrowers, then took his cut so consistently that it felt, to those who paid it, like part of the weather. The law's answer was to strip away the sentiment and count the acts. The street's answer was to note that other men stepped into the gaps as soon as he was gone. There is one more layer to the legacy, the oddest and the most stubborn. His surname now lives in a line of legal text that comes up whenever a judge weighs whether to keep someone inside before trial for reasons that read like an accountant's ledger. Law students, who have never smelled a social club's coffee or seen a betting ledger folded into a jacket, learn his name as a principle. Public safety includes markets, not just flesh. They argue about that definition in classrooms and clinics, and their arguments shape outcomes for people he would not recognize. It is a strange afterlife for a man who built his world on staying off paper. But the city and the law do not ask a life what form its echoes should take. Walk the old block in your mind, and you can still see how it worked. A storefront that looked like any other. Blinds tilted to keep out glare and curiosity. A back table where decisions lived, not on letterhead but in habits. Runners who knew when to hurry and when to dawdle. Collectors who knew which staircase creaked. Union men who wore resolve like a suit and could make a grievance evaporate by Thursday if asked the right way on Tuesday. Contractors who needed a pour to happen at 7 and were willing to pay to make it so. A boss who liked his coffee a certain way and preferred half sentences to speeches. It is easy to romanticize that scene. He did not. He treated it as work, profitable and risky, steady when done properly, ruinous when done carelessly. He did it properly until the day the world outside decided to change the rules and the tools. If you were to place his life on a shelf, it would sit near books about how cities function in practice rather than theory. It would sit near casebooks that treat human need as a variable in an equation. It would sit near oral histories where people speak about safety and pressure in the same breath. He was not a mystery. He was a product of a place and a time, skilled at reading appetite and converting it into streams of money that fed a crew, a family, an enterprise. He fell because patience and tools improved on the other side as well, and because the city finally decided that predictability purchased in secret costs too much. He never gave the last word. He held to silence as if it were the only possession he could keep. In that, he was consistent to the end. Others wrote him, argued him, denounced him, defended him, and reduced him to a nickname that stuck longer than anyone expected. The truth, pared down, is that Anthony Salerno lived a long life inside New York's shadow system, climbed to the top tier of its earners and arbiters, helped bend unions and industries toward private rules, and paid for it with a century of sentencing that outlived his years. He left behind the places he had touched: tenement steps, club chairs, job site trailers, court benches, and a set of lessons about how cities are managed in whispers until the day those whispers become evidence. The sun moved its thin rectangle across the floor one last time, and then it was gone. The room dimmed to the usual hum. Outside, the city he had read like a ledger for decades kept its pace. Trains on schedule, trucks at dawn, concrete setting by afternoon. Windows slid into frames as crews checked off a list. New names learned old routes. New rules tried to narrow old levers. The door on that East Harlem block grew older. Then it changed, as all doors do. People walked by without looking up. The story settled into the background noise of the place that made him, part cautionary tale, part history lesson, part reminder that order, when sold in secret, always sends someone else the bill. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Anthony Salerno here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through loyalty, patience, and respect. If this story helped you drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the whispers of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.